Reading the Times for Tuesday, February 18th, 2020. Huawei is winning the argument in Europe as the U.S. fumbles to develop alternatives. Mr. Pence, in remarks to CNBC, said the best response to Huawei was to free up airwaves for use in 5G networks operated by American carriers. Many of us in Europe agree that there are significant dangers with Huawei, and the U.S. for at least a year have been telling us, do not use Huawei. Are you offering an alternative? Said Tuomas Hendrik Ilves, Estonia's former president. Germany, like Britain, is expected to keep Huawei out of the most sensitive parts of the telecom network, but allow the firm to provide equipment and software for the radio networks that control cell towers and base stations around the country. As Afghan soldier kills 2 Americans, peace talks forge ahead. So on February 8th, a group of Afghan commandos accompanied by Green Berets arrived early in the morning in helicopters to see if they could help, according to interviews with more than a dozen Afghan and American officials. Sergeant Jawed, his weapon at hand, emerged from the side entrance of the building just after 6 p.m., took a dozen steps toward an Afghan army vehicle where several other Afghan soldiers were. At the same time, U.S. forces have shrunk their presence and interaction with regular Afghan soldiers, American airstrikes have reached record numbers, often pounding areas close to where the soldiers come from and sometimes killing civilians. They escaped an infected ship, but the flight home was no haven. A day before, 328 Americans were to be whisked away from a containment cruise ship in Japan. The U.S. Embassy in Tokyo told passengers that no one affected with the coronavirus would be allowed to board charter flights to the United States, even as Americans were flying home, and countries like Australia, Canada, and South Korea were preparing to evacuate their own citizens. The Japanese Health Ministry announced on Monday that 99 more cases had been confirmed on the cruise ship, bringing the total to 454. Among them was the third Japanese public health official to contract the virus while tending to passengers and crew members aboard the ship, the Diamond Princess. In a briefing on Monday, Shigeru Omi, president of the Japan Community Healthcare Organization, said that Japan had made the right decision to put the ship in quarantine based on the information available when the ship arrived in Yokohama on February 3rd. Apple signals coronavirus threat to global business. Apple, which is widely regarded as a bellwether of global supply and demand for goods, has bet big on China in recent years, even if all of the factories that make iPhones get back up to speed in China. Apple faces other challenges there. Apple said in its statement that demand for its product and services outside China was in line with expectations. Past remarks are challenging for Bloomberg and fair game for rivals, as the criticism swelled over his record on race and inequality. Mr. Bloomberg was in Houston cutting the ribbon on a new initiative for his presidential campaign called Mike for Black America. Mayor Sylvester Turner of Houston, whose endorsement Mr. Bloomberg has pursued for weeks, delivered an impassioned speech, as did the mayors of Columbia, South Carolina, and Washington, both of whom are also helping Mr. Bloomberg with his African-American outreach. For the past 2 months, Mr. Bloomberg's presidential campaign has been lining up endorsements, adjusting its messages to voters, and expanding its reach across the country with an eye toward the moment it knew it would come, when Mr. Bloomberg, the 78-year-old multi-billionaire and former mayor of New York, would no longer be an afterthought in the race, but a prime target, and decades worth of impolitic and insensitive remarks, as well as problematic policy stances, would face renewed scrutiny. Over the weekend, the concern about Mr. Bloomberg's ascendancy was evident as rival Democrats campaigning in Nevada unleashed a barrage of attacks on the former mayor, including familiar laments that he was trying to buy an election and new criticism aided by resurfaced videos that invoked his past controversies. Payout from a national opioids settlement won't be as big as hoped. Even plaintiff lawyers now believe the payout from dozens of opioid makers, distributors, and retailers is likely to be less than half of what the big four tobacco companies agreed to pay more than 20 years ago in a landmark settlement with states over costs associated with millions of smoking-related deaths. The dozens of companies targeted in the opioid lawsuit do some very good things, said Mr. Rice, including making or selling an array of medicines, vitamins, and medical devices, as well as drugstore products like shampoo and baby lotion. Until recently, a broad national opioid settlement seemed elusive. How China tracked detainees and their families. A leaked government document showed how people were monitored and selected for internment camps in Xinjiang. Rosinias Metati, an ethnic Uyghur, learned from a leaked Chinese government document that some of her family members had been sent to indoctrination camps. The document, one of numerous files kept on more than 1 million people who have been detained in the camps, shows the range of behaviors that the authorities see as problematic that would be normal elsewhere, such as giving up alcohol, wanting to go on religious pilgrimage, or attending a funeral. Boris Johnson aide quits after furor over racial comments. The warning signs may have been there last month when Dominique Cummings, the influential and iconoclastic aide to Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain, invited weirdos and misfits to apply to work at Downing Street. The episode had both shown a light on Mr. Johnson's leadership team and illustrated the sway that Mr. Cummings holds in Downing Street, where he cuts a distinctive scruffy figure and has established himself as one of the most powerful and polarizing figures in the government. The decision to hire Mr. Sabitsky may even so prove damaging for Mr. Johnson, in part because he has himself used racist language in his writings. Battling coronavirus, China signals delay of its top party gathering. Chinese officials said the annual full meeting of the National People's Congress, which typically takes place with pomp and pageantry in early March, could be delayed because of the outbreak, a highly unusual symbolic blow to a government that typically runs with regimented discipline. Public health experts said the dip in new infections was probably a result of the government's decision to impose travel restrictions in many cities, including Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak. There is a recognition that the central government and the top leadership needs to be seen as doing something more proactive than simply pinning the blame on Hubei and Wuhan government, said Stephen Zhang, the director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. China detains activists who accused Xi of coronavirus cover-up. Over the weekend, Xu Ziyong, a prominent Chinese legal activist, went silent. Mr. Xu, a 46-year-old former university lecturer, has long railed against government corruption and social injustice in China. Faced with growing public anger over the coronavirus outbreak, China's leader has cited a need to strengthen the guidance of public opinion, a term that has often referred to blocking independent news reporting and censoring critical comments on Chinese social media. Cambodia's coronavirus complacency may exact a global toll. When Cambodia's prime minister greeted passengers on a cruise ship amid a coronavirus scare on Valentine's Day, embraces were the order of the day. Now health officials worry that what Cambodia opened its doors to was the outbreak, and the world may pay a price as passengers from cruise ships Westerdam stream home. Health monitoring for the rest of the passengers was limited to a handful of temperature checks conducted with infrared thermometers, passengers say. Now we are refugees, a family in limbo amid the coronavirus outbreak. Others said Taiwan should not help to evacuate mainland Chinese spouses of Taiwan residents. Ms. Cheng said she was told by Chinese officials she could return to Taiwan on a second chartered flight scheduled for February 5th. On Wednesday, Taiwan's Central Epidemic Command Center announced that children who have mainland citizenship but a Taiwanese parent would not be allowed to enter Taiwan for the time being if they were arriving from mainland China, Hong Kong, or Macau. Coronavirus empties European cities of Chinese tourists, from the streets of Paris to the wineries of Burgundy, from the German town of Fusan near the fairy tale castles of Neuschwanstein to a shopping outlet in Oxfordshire, England, and the numbers of Chinese tourists have visibly dropped since Beijing banned overseas group tours on January 27th. Fears were heightened over the weekend after an 80-year-old Chinese tourist died of the virus at hospital in Paris, the first fatality outside Asia since the start of the outbreak. The company has aggressively courted Chinese tourists to Paris and also opened stores in China. In Dijon, Chinese tourists' second favorite French city after Paris, Chinese tour operators canceled reservations for 3,000 rooms in about 40 hotels in February. Senator Tom Cotton repeats fringe theory of coronavirus origins. Senator Tom Cotton, Republican of Arkansas, has repeated an unsubstantiated conspiracy theory, which has spread from small-town China to the right-wing news media in the United States. The new coronavirus originated in a high-security biochemical lab in Wuhan, the Chinese city at the outbreak center. In a television interview on Fox News on Sunday, Mr. Cotton suggested that a dearth of information about the origins of the virus, which causes the disease COVID-19, raised more questions than answers. He then raised the possibility that the virus originated in a biosafety level 4 super laboratory. Such laboratories are used for research into potentially deadly infectious diseases. Johnson faces scrutiny for flooding response after Storm Dennis. Mr. Johnson came under fire on Monday after his office said he had no plans to visit any of the flooded areas after Storm Dennis. With the ground already saturated, there's a chance of further flooding, he said in a statement, urging public to keep an eye on flood warnings. Given the major flooding in the past couple of weeks, and the changes in the frequency and intensity of weather incidents, it appears that our flood defense systems require improvement, he said in an email. With Libya still at war, EU agrees to try blocking weapons flow. The European Union agreed on Monday to launch a new naval and air mission to stop more arms reaching the warring factions in Libya, overcoming initial objections from Austria and Hungary, which feared the ships might attract migrants and enable more of them to reach Europe. The new mission will be limited to the eastern Mediterranean, where most arms smuggling to Libya takes place, away from the routes most migrants take to try to reach Europe from chaotic Libya. Mr. Di Maio also said that the mission creates a pull factor, that is to say, the ships attract migrants, the mission will be stopped. Austrian Foreign Minister Alexander Schallenberg said similarly that Vienna would be vigilant for any signs that the mission, which will take several weeks to set up, was attracting migrants into Europe. There will be a basic consensus that we now want a military operation and not a humanitarian mission, he said. Oh, there is a basic consensus that now we want a military operation and not a humanitarian mission. Biden, seeking revival, is counting on at least second place in Nevada. Left unsaid, Nevada will also show whether Mr. Biden, the former president vice, can revive his campaign. After his first two finishes, sent his national poll numbers plummeting, putting his donors on edge and jeopardized his standing, even in his perceived firewall state, South Carolina. Mr. Biden is expressing a much sunnier outlook about how he will fare in Nevada, compared with New Hampshire, where he predicted 4 days before the primary, that he would probably take a hit. At a fundraiser in New York City last week, he said he expected to finish first or second in Nevada. Mr. Biden's allies have played down the significance of Iowa and New Hampshire and insist that Mr. Biden remains poised to perform strongly in more diverse states like Nevada. Virginia legislature turns down ban on military-style weapons. A bill that would have banned military-style rifles in Virginia was defeated in the state Senate on Monday, a sign of the limited power of the state's new Democratic majority in enacting the most restrictive elements of its gun control agenda, and a blow to Governor Ralph Northam's efforts to restrict gun possession. The prohibition on military-style rifles was the most contentious of a series of gun control bills making their way through the state legislature this year, and the centerpiece of Democrats' attempts to restrict firearms after a gunman fatally shot 12 people in Virginia Beach last May. The state is at the heart of a long-simmering debate related to the nation's uneasy accommodation regarding gun laws, with Democrats in the state's urban areas and suburbs supporting gun control measures, while many rural residents have mounted a large gun rights protest in response. The National Rifle Association cheered the bill's demise, saying that while people who owned assault rifles would not have to surrender their weapons to state authorities, those who possessed high-capacity magazines might have had to turn them in. Young, conservative, and working for Trump, the dating pool is small. In the end, the nuptials were stocked with Trump administration officials, including Mr. Trump, Vice President Mike Pence, and the people who loved the couple. John Pence, the vice president's nephew and a Trump campaign official, and Giovanna Chiola, a White House aide and the cousin of Kellyanne Conway, the counselor to the president, were married in Atlantic City last year. Julie Spira, a dating coach and author of Love in the Age of Trump, How Politics is Polarizing Relationships, said politics had become the number one deal breaker for singles, with many holding Mr. Trump responsible for cleaving a wider cultural divide. Reality winner imprisoned for leaking Russian hacking report seeks clemency. The contractor, Reality L winner, that's her name. The contractor, Reality L winner 28, petitioned the office of the pardon attorney, which is part of the Justice Department, to commute the rest of a 63-month sentence that she received in 2018. A lawyer for Miss Winner submitted more than 4,500 letters of support from members of the public with the application. During a news conference in Dallas on Monday, Miss Winner's family said that they hoped the materials would prompt Mr. Trump's intervention in the case. At the time of Miss Winner's sentencing, Mr. Trump said on Twitter that the punishment was unfair and that what Miss Winner had done was small potatoes compared to what Hillary Clinton did. Bloomberg's campaign opens first attack on a Democratic rival, Bernie Sanders. Mr. Bloomberg's campaign began the day by posting a video cataloging instances of online aggression and threats from Sanders supporters toward rival Democrats, then followed with a statement offering an unflattering comparison of Mr. Sanders and Mr. Trump. The Bloomberg campaign statement detailed a half-dozen anti-Bloomberg statements from Sanders surrogates and staff, calling them unacceptable. One, a tweet from a Sanders campaign national press secretary, Brianna Joy Gray, called Mr. Bloomberg a racist authoritarian. One union official said she had received hundreds of messages from Sanders supporters with insults and threats. Mr. Sanders responded with a statement urging supporters of all campaigns not to engage in bullying or ugly personal attacks. Bolton hints at further revelations if he overcomes White House censorship. John R. Bolton, the former national security advisor to President Trump, suggested on Monday that his unpublished book contained far more revelations than just the campaign to pressure Ukraine for help with domestic politics, but said he was fighting censorship by the White House. While the White House has asserted that the book, The Room Where It Happened, contains classified information that will have to be excised before it can be published, Mr. Bolton's lawyer has denied that and said it should be released as scheduled on March 17th. Some House Democrats have talked about subpoenaing Mr. Bolton to testify on the side of the Capitol, even though the trial is over. But Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other leaders have indicated they do not want to proceed with such a move at this point. While praising Mr. Trump for abandoning President Barack Obama's nuclear deal with Iran, Mr. Bolton said that the president had not fulfilled his own promise to strangle Tehran's theocratic leadership through economic sanctions and other methods. 6-year-old held in mental health center for 2 days without mother's consent. Tracy A. Pierce, a spokeswoman for Duval County Public Schools, said it was Child Guidance, a crisis response firm, that has decided to have the girl admitted to the mental health center, not the school. An incident report from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office said the girl was destroying school's property and attacking staff, out of control and running out of school. The school district said that the officers in the video were not present during the events which motivated the school to call Child Guidance, or when the health counselor was intervening with a student. Doctor's suicide note has parents asking, was my child really vaccinated? After speaking with some patients, the investigators learned that Dr. Coynes, who had been licensed to practice medicine in the state since 1991, was a proponent of homeopathic medicine. Sheriff Dart said Dr. Coynes had about 2,500 patients at the time of his death, but it was unclear how many patients he had treated over the past decade, or why the doctor had a number of patients who did not live in the general area. Sheriff Dart said. In the statement, the sheriff's office encouraged former patients to consult with the current physicians and inquire about methods to test for prior vaccinations. At least one local school district had publicly reiterated concerns from the sheriff's office. Give the new bail reform law time to work. It just so happens that the campaign to roll back New York's landmark bail reforms is unfolding as Michael Bloomberg's presidential run forces a reckoning with stop and frisk, the policing tactic that led to the harassment and humiliation of millions of innocent people, most of them black and Hispanic boys and men. While Mr. Bloomberg was mayor of New York City, police officials and prosecutors made arguments about stop and frisk that sound familiar in the current conversation about bail reform. Even before the reforms, New York law didn't allow judges to consider dangerousness when setting bail. These reforms were enacted by a legislature and governor elected by New York voters, who in 2018 delivered Democrats a clear majority in the state Senate for the first time in years. Have zombies eaten Bloomberg and Buttigieg's brains? In the modern United States, most important zombie ideas are on the right, kept undead by big money from billionaires who have a financial interest in getting people to believe things that aren't true. First, lenders got caught up in gigantic housing bubble. Then, when the bubble burst, much of the financial system just froze up. At the same time that Bloomberg is being called out on his housing bubble zombie, Pete Buttigieg is facing justified criticism for buying into another zombie idea, the obsession with government debt. Let Bernie Madoff and many more out of prison. Recently, Mr. Madoff re-entered the news as he filed for compassionate release from federal prison. The visceral retributive reactions to Mr. Madoff's petition, including from liberals who claim to want to end mass incarceration, reveal the obstacles to transformational criminal justice reform, creating a separate category for Mr. Madoff. Sex offenders or those others in the criminal justice system will not help end mass incarceration. Why don't we know which Democratic candidates can beat Trump? Voters in Iowa and New Hampshire saw more of Mr. Biden than voters anywhere else, and entrance polls showed voters in both states prioritizing electability over all issues. Black voters are the backbone of the Democratic Party, but so far white voters have discounted their views. Sunny Hostin, a former prosecutor and co-host of The View, called the case one of the most flawed investigations and prosecutions I think I've ever seen, but both have been propelled forward because white voters have made up nearly all the votes cast so far. The bees and other creatures of my childhood are disappearing. Extinction, although understood as awful, seems exotic. In my head, my childhood bird list has just taken a 30% hit. Eventually, the trellis seemed to sink into the lawn. France's challenge in Africa. France rushed in troops, and French and local forces freed those towns, followed by a United Nations stabilization force. Sending 600 extra French troops is not meant as a game changer on the ground, but as a morale booster for a country like Niger, badly shaken by devastating attacks against its armed forces. Florence Parly, the French Minister of the Armed Forces, flew to Washington 2 weeks ago to make her case, noting that an American citizen was amongst hostages freed by French special forces last year on the border between Mali and Burkina Faso in an operation that cost the life of 2 French commandos. Should parents stop making school lunches? Part of the reason my little boy, who goes to a great public school in Manhattan, doesn't like school lunches is that his lunch period is short, and the lunch line eats into it substantially. As a middle-class mother of 4 who need to spend $61 a week who would need to spend $61 a week if I allowed my children to get school lunch, I found Jennifer Gaddis's claim that my actions reduce the political will and financial resources necessary to make public schools lunches better for everyone quite narrow-minded. Her article stated that if only parents participated in the school lunch program, then items such as grass-fed beef would be more readily available. When pharmacists make drug errors, the current system sets pharmacists up to fail. Paul Krugman explains how Republicans have gained political advantage by blocking fiscal stimulus when it was badly needed during the Great Recession, then supporting profligate stimulus policies well after the economy had recovered. So why not give banks more incentives to serve low-income people? A Latino worker, a risky construction site, and a family in mourning. A week before the accident, Segundo Huerta's wife said her husband had complained to her that the boss at the Bronx construction site where he had worked was pressuring his laborers, berating them for working too slowly. In weeks after Mr. Huerta's death, members of the Workers' Justice Project, an advocacy group, said that they had been contacted by an acquaintance of someone who was working at the Bronx site. Abazi Okoro, the superintendent of construction listed on the permit at the Bronx site, who is required to be present whenever work is taking place, was not there on the day of Mr. Huerta's death, several workers said. A legal lion lays down his gavel with a ruling of love, not hate. Born in Kansas in 1921, Judge Weinstein earned his law degree in 1948 from Columbia University after playing bit parts on Broadway and serving as a submarine officer in the Pacific Theater during World War II. In his early years as a lawyer, he helped write legal briefs in the landmark civil rights case Brown versus the Board of Education. At the height of his career, Judge Weinstein, who is known for his impressive eyebrows and his iconoclastic temperament, handled several high-profile mafia cases, including the prosecution of Vincent Gigante, known as the Chin, the former boss of the Genovese crime family. In the past decade, Judge Weinstein turns his attention even further toward legal changes, publicly calling for more female lawyers to have speaking roles in court, and decrying the lack of sentencing alternatives for violent young criminals who, he said, are often written off as society's unredeemables. He has also tackled the endemic problem of police officers lying on the witness stand. Life of a CIA coder, Nerf, guns, pranks, and fat jokes. For the past 2 weeks, Mr. Schultz's former colleagues and law enforcement officials have taken the stand to explain a thicket of CIA computer networks, guiding jurors through a digital trail that prosecutors say led to Mr. Schultz as the leaker. Mr. Schultz, who was known for being a difficult colleague, had a particularly strained relationship with another developer, identified only as a mole. During an argument in early 2016 between the two men, Mr. Weber testified that he tried to intervene, telling Mr. Schultz to be the bigger man. Mr. Schultz responded, we all know who the bigger man is, a reference to a mole's weight. According to Mr. Weber, Mr. Schultz's defense team had subpoenaed at least 69 current or former CIA employees to testify at trial, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who was CIA director during WikiLeaks disclosures. How millennials could make the Fed's job harder. Millennials, already accused of killing everything from paper napkins to mayonnaise, would happily exacerbate the drop in interest rate, which baby boomers have driven to date. In the United States, for example, rates are now in the range of just 1.5% to 1.75%, leaving the Fed room for about 6 quarter-point rate cuts in a downturn. That's what makes millennial retirement behavior so interesting. It is a wild card still, one that could slightly lift or substantially lower rates going forward. Bloomberg's news dilemma: how to cover a boss seeking the presidency. New employees receive a copy of his autobiography, Bloomberg by Bloomberg, and company guidelines prohibit coverage of his wealth or personal life. In 2018, Mr. Bloomberg told an interviewer, I don't want the reporters I'm paying to write a bad story about me. Mr. Micklethwait has no contact with Mr. Bloomby or his campaign since he declared his bid, according to a spokesman for Bloomby News. The distinction has not stopped critics like Ms. Warren from accusing Mr. Bloomby of betraying the First Amendment. A spokeswoman for Bloomby News said in a statement, Over the past 30 years, editorial independence has been the core of Bloomby News. We're proud of more than 760 articles Bloomby News has published on election and candidates, not to mention a host of broadcast interviews since Mike Bloomby announced he was running for president. Jeff Bezos commits $10 billion to address climate change. Jeff Bezos, Amazon's chief executive and the world's richest man, said on Monday he was committing $10 billion to address the climate crisis in a new initiative he called the Bezos Earth Fund. The effort will fund scientists, activists, and non-governmental organizations, Mr. Bezos said in a post on Instagram. In September, Mr. Bezos unveiled the Climate Pledge, committing Amazon to meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement 10 years ahead of schedule and to be carbon neutral by 2040. Mr. Bezos made the pledge after Amazon's employees agitated on climate change. A giant milk industry merger moves closer with $425 million deal. It's a hard time to be a dairy farmer in America. The nationwide decline in milk consumption and the rippling effects of the trade war with China have pushed thousands of farmers out of business in a deal that is likely to draw scrutiny from government antitrust regulators. Dairy Farmers of America, the country's largest milk cooperative, announced on Monday that it had reached an agreement to purchase a substantial portion of the bankrupt milk company Dean Foods. 2 decades ago, Dairy Farmers of America was founded to help small farmers market their raw milk to dairy processing companies like Dean Foods, which prepared milk for distribution to retailers. Video game makers want to get players off the couch. Our latest data shows 73% of U.S. consumers play video games of one sort or another, said Matt Piscatella, an industry analyst for NPD. Given the wide range of players, the industry does have great opportunity to provide more gaming experience variety. Part of the switch is an acknowledgement that Nintendo's main competition is no longer just Microsoft and Sony, but Apple and Google too, said Philip Tan, a creative director of MIT Game Lab. He added that Nintendo was drawing on its strength in creating games that bridge the digital and physical world. Beat Saber, a music game from Beat Games, relies on virtual reality goggles. It sold more than 1 million copies in 9 months after being introduced in 2018. But Ring Fit is attracting a growing number of fans to the gameplay. Pier 1 Imports, the struggling home goods retailer, files for bankruptcy. We have worked to establish an appropriately sized and profitable store footprint, operating structure, and merchandise assortment that will enable Pier 1 to better serve our customers across store and online channels, he said in a statement. This company's online store, as well as over 400 brick and mortar locations that remain open will continue operating as normal, according to the statement. The company, which grew out of a store in San Mateo, California in 1962, was the first national chain to announce major closings this year. The struggle to mend America's rural roads. The farmers, truckers, and others who traverse these rural roads could quickly tell you what the hieroglyphics mean. Help. Like hundreds of other small agricultural counties and towns around the country, Trempealeau County in central west Wisconsin is overwhelmed with aging, damaged roads, and not enough money to fix them. Our roads haven't been paid since the 60s, said Kellen Nelson, whose family owns Triple Brook Farms on County Road O outside Oseo. Still damaged is a 15-ton bridge east of the farm on County Road OO that requires him and his neighbors to reroute their combines and semi-trucks. And that has been Reading in the Times for Tuesday, February 18th, 2020.